that's not Phil," looking at me. And they said, "He looks just like Phil from our church." And I said, "No." And they said, "No, that's not Phil." And I said, "Well, anyway, it was nice to meet you. I like your shirt, and I go to church too. I'm a born-again believer too, and I just wanted to encourage you guys." And they said, "Yeah, we just all go to church together, and every so often, as often as we can, we get together, for coffee and to pray with each other and just to see what's going on with each other's lives and families." 3 different guys, 3 different races, 3 different ages, all different, but yet Christ called them all to follow him. And I walked in and ordered my coffee. And what's the manliest way to order coffee? What's the manliest coffee you can buy? Black. Yeah, someone said it. All right, so I'm not alone. I order my coffee black, unless I'm with Larry. Then I make an exception. Larry and I go for coffee. The last 2 times we went out for coffee, the coffee place had just closed. I think that they see us coming, they say, "Oh, we better close the shop, lock the doors." And I went in and I ordered my coffee. I say, "I'll have a coffee," and you got to say it nice and loud so everyone in the coffee shop knows what kind of man you are. And you say, "I'll order coffee, black." My wife says, "You don't have to say black. They'll give it to you black if you just say coffee." So that's the best part, is saying, "I want it black coffee." It's terrible. I don't like it, but I order it black because it's the man. It takes me forever to drink because it's so bad, but I drink it anyway. Starting to get used to it. As we were walking out, I greeted the guys again and said, "Hey guys, it was nice to meet you." And then to the first guy who had the Christian shirt, I said, "It was good to see you again, Phil." And I shook his hand, and they were all laughing as they walked away. But it was so good to see Jesus calling all different people, different races, different ages, different cultures, different backgrounds. You wouldn't see those 3 guys at a table if it wasn't for Jesus. Just the different walks of life, but he brings everybody together. And he calls all different people to follow him. That day, we really only had 2 things in common. Myself and those 3 guys, the 4 of us all together. The first one is that we were all following Jesus. Does anyone know what the second one was? There's a lot of other things, but for the sake of the joke, there's one other thing. None of us were named Phil. So there's that. Today we want to talk about a couple people. First of all, we want to talk about Mary Magdalene. We want to talk about who she was. Point number 1, if you're filling in the blanks there, hope for the hopeless. As we look at Mary's life, we see that we could put a title on it, if it were a book, to say hope for the hopeless. Who was Mary Magdalene? Jesus brought her hope when she lived in a hopeless situation, because Jesus saw people, not property. He sees us as people, not property. There's something important we should know about their culture and the culture of Jesus' day. When we learn a little bit more about their culture, it makes the message of Mary and what happened between Mary and Jesus even more powerful. Just like our culture is different from a number of other different cultures, when a child loses their tooth in our culture, of course, what do we do with that tooth? It makes perfect sense. What do? We put it under a pillow, because that's the most logical place to put a tooth, right? That when you lose a tooth, everyone in the world should know that you take that tooth and you put it under a pillow for a fairy to come and take that tooth and leave you a few bucks, right? Everyone knows that. Well, in a lot of countries of the world, like Greece and a number of others, you know what they do? Because they think the most logical thing for a child to do when that child loses a tooth is to throw the tooth on the roof, right? So that the pig can come and get it. Everybody knows that the pig comes and gets the kid's tooth from the roof, just like everyone here knows that, well, a fairy comes and gets it, of course, from under the pillow. Or like Chevy, when they started expanding into South America, they were selling the Chevy Nova. It was a big hit here in North America, but they started selling it down there in South America, and nobody was buying it. Months went by, and nobody was buying it. So they looked in, did some market research, and they found that Chevy Nova wasn't selling because in Spanish, Nova means doesn't go. And so they're trying to sell a truck called Chevy Won't Go. And nobody's going to buy a car that's called the Won't Go, because then when it breaks down, you look kind of dumb for buying a car that's called Won't Go. So they changed the name, and it was selling just fine. But there's something important about knowing the culture, and many times that can make all the difference and make the message even more powerful. Well, when Jesus called Mary, and he set Mary free, we'll see in a few minutes. She was possessed by 7 demons. Her life was a mess. But when Jesus reached out to Mary, it was in a very specific day and culture. The Greeks, the Romans, and the Jews, they were kind of the primary culture setters in those days. In the Greek culture in Jesus' day, they would not allow women to leave the home unless the woman was escorted by a man. They would not permit a woman to interact with male guests within the house. So Greek culture said if men come to the house or come to the home, the woman is to go back to her quarters and not come out until everybody has left. The women would not go to school, and they would not speak in public. And basically, in the Greek mind, the woman had the social status or value the same as a slave. In the Roman culture in Jesus' day, The woman was under absolute control of her husband, and if she wasn't married, she was under absolute control of her father. Herself, all her comings and goings, and all of her possessions were under the absolute control of a man. She must wear a veil when she goes out in public, and she may not speak at all when she's out in public. And in Jewish culture in Jesus' day, a woman would not be permitted to speak in public. She would not be allowed to read the scriptures out loud, if she could read at all. And in the times of worship, she would be segregated, and she was never to make a sound. So that's the culture in which Jesus lived and walked. But we see Jesus' culture is different. Jesus treated women different than everyone else in his day and age. It was revolutionary. He did a great deal for women's rights and civil rights. But we see in the Jesus culture, in Jesus' mind, he valued women equal to men. He spoke to them in public, at meetings with prominent men, and in private. Remember the story of the Samaritan woman in John chapter 4. He broke all kinds of cultural rules when he spoke to that woman. First of all, she's a woman unattended by a male in public. She's a Samaritan, he's a Jew, there's bad blood there. Women are not permitted to speak to men in public, yet Jesus broke through all those barriers to reach out to her and changed her life, and changed a whole town for that matter, because he reached out to her. In Luke chapter 7, verse 48, Jesus is at a meeting, he's at a meal with Pharisees, some of the social elite, the religious elite, and with all these cultural rules in mind. Keep that in mind when you read it and you see that a woman who's a sinful woman or a prostitute comes in and starts washing Jesus' feet with her tears, touching him and washing him, and he speaks to her in front of all of these prominent men, and he says, "Your sins are forgiven you." Remember that? Jesus was breaking through all kinds of cultural barriers and rules. He touched the woman who had the blood flow, or she reached out and touched him. He healed women. He ate with women in John chapter 12. He taught them in Matthew chapter 5 through 7. He even used women in his ministry. We see here in Luke chapter 8 verse 3. We'll read it in a moment. But he loved women as if they were his own precious daughters, not as if they were just some piece of property or someone that needs to have all these rules and controls set on them. He loved them as if they were his own precious daughters. Why is that? Because they are. He created them. He made them. He has a plan for their life. He loves them. And he loves you, and he loves the men as if they are his own precious sons. But when we see Mary, when Jesus first meets her, she's a woman tormented by evil spirits. Luke chapter 8, verse 1 through 3. I'll read it out loud for you. Afterward, Jesus journeyed from one town and village to another, preaching and proclaiming the good news of the kingdom of God. Accompanying him were the 12 and some women who had been cured of evil spirits and infirmities. Mary, called Magdalene, from whom 7 demons had gone out. Joanna, the wife of Herod's steward Chuza, Susanna, and many others who provided for them out of their own resources. Before Mary met Jesus, she was a woman whose life was out of control. She lived in a small town by the sea, and her life was a mess. She was tormented by evil spirits. Today, in our culture, where we're not so much a spiritual culture, you know what we would have said about her? She's crazy, or she's mentally ill, right? I think there is something to mental illness. There is something, sometimes the chemical balance is off and different things like that. But I think some of these guys that go around shooting up movie theaters or schools or things like that are just flat out demon possessed, right? Very well could be. She was demon possessed, her life out of control. Luke says she was under the control of 7 demons, and then Jesus set her free. So what did that mean for Mary? Put yourself in her shoes. Put yourself in her mother's shoes or her father's shoes. Did Mary have hope of any kind of a future before she met Jesus? 7 evil spirits, unable to control herself. She was unwanted. She held no value in her culture, in her family, in her society. She was just another mouth to feed. She was probably a nuisance to her own family. As much as they may have tried to have loved her or cared for her, she probably was very problematic within her family. Most teachers would never talk to a woman. Leaders, those who were having disciples or apprentices, they wouldn't have gone to talk to a woman. But no teacher would ever think of approaching a troubled, demon-possessed, miserable woman like Mary Magdalene. No teacher would ever permit a woman like this to follow them. But Jesus did, didn't he? Jesus was different. Jesus healed her and called her to follow him and allowed her even to contribute to the ministry. As the end of that verse that we read, Luke chapter 8, verse 3 says, and these women that followed, they gave out of anything they could. They gave out of their own resources. They gave from their own means. Whatever they could contribute to the ministry, they contributed to the ministry. And Mary followed Jesus with a passion. She left her home to follow him, we see at the beginning of Luke chapter 8. Think about it. That was unheard of in that culture, wasn't it? A woman wasn't free just to get up and leave her house and leave her father's house or her husband's house to go pursue her education or to go follow a teacher. You couldn't do that in those days, in that culture. Yet Mary did it. Women were supposed to be home until they were married, and then they were to be in their husband's home. This could have been very upsetting to their family, that she would break out of their culture like this, that she would leave the home. Maybe they were upset about it, or maybe they were really happy for her that she was healed. Or, very possibly, maybe they were just happy she was out of the house, right? Wow, it's been so much work. It's been so difficult. We don't know what to do with her anymore. You'll take her. She can follow you. Fine. Go. God bless. Go ahead. You know, it's one less thing we need to worry about. Who knows? I don't know what they were thinking, but just think through those options of what her family thought when she was healed by Jesus, and then she took off to follow with some other women and the disciples. But Mary shook off the social norms, and she went on to live an adventure with Jesus. She went from town to town, watching Jesus as he would teach and hearing the teachings of Jesus about the kingdom of God and the hope and the salvation and the redemption. She would see the miracles. She would feed the hungry along with Jesus and the disciples. What an adventure she would live. And she gave all that she could to follow Jesus. It says she gave out of her own resources, from her own means. She gave whatever she could to help in that ministry with Jesus. And then who was there at the cross? Anyone remember John 19 when it lists the people at the cross? Were the 12 disciples standing there with Jesus? Peter saying, I'll die for you, Lord. Thomas earlier saying, let's go, we'll die with him. Were they there at the cross, the big strong men? They weren't. It was Jesus' mother, was another one of their relatives, and then a couple ladies named Mary Magdalene being one of them, at the foot of the cross. At the time when she could have been arrested and killed just the same, when the men ran in fear, she stood with Jesus. If you're following in our outline run, capital letter C, and that's number 3. When the men ran in fear, she stood with Jesus. You know, there's a story of men working out at a gym, going to the gym, and you got the guys. I see Shad at the gym sometimes, and they're at the gym, and they got their tank tops on, they got their big muscles, they got their fresh tattoos, they got their new running shoes, they got the fancy shorts with like the reflective stuff on the side for when they go out for jogs, and they're looking sharp, and they're flexing in the mirror, and they're lifting weights, and they're flirting with the ladies, and they're showing how much weight they can lift and how many chin-ups they can do and how tough and big and strong they are. And then all of a sudden a woman screams, "Ah, a mouse!" And there's a mouse running through the gym. And all those men all of a sudden didn't look so tough anymore. A guy jumps up and puts his armpit around the chin-up bar, and he's hanging on the bar. A few guys jump up on the weight benches, and they're up on their toes hiding from this mouse. And some guys just put their hands up and run out the front door of the gym. And everybody's up and hiding and off the ground and scared, and people are all hitting the walls. And then the little kids from the daycare, they come out. And 2 5-year-old girls step out because they're scared. There's all this yelling, and weights are dropping, and there's all this noise. What's going on? And then they see the little mouse run right past them. And the mouse goes into a corner, and the 2 little girls chase after the mouse. And these 2 5-year-old girls, they corner the mouse in the corner of the gym, and one of them catches the mouse and picks it up, is going, "Oh, how cute a little mouse." And the other girls say, "Let me hold the mouse. Oh, how cute a little mouse." And how manly do you think those men felt in that moment? Think they were flirting with the ladies after that? All the men ran and hid in fear. But Mary, she had the courage to stand with Jesus. She had the love to stand by Jesus. Mary stood there bravely, courageously. John 19:25. But standing by the cross of Jesus were his mother, his mother's sister, Mary the wife of Clopas, and Mary Magdalene, the one whom Jesus had set free, the one who left her family and pursued this awesome adventure, walking the road with Jesus. She stood there. I teach my kids, my daughters, that courage or bravery doesn't mean you're not afraid. You don't need to be courageous when you're not afraid. But being courageous or being brave is when you are afraid, yet you still do the right thing. You do what you know is right, even when you are afraid. So the next time you're afraid, remember that. Hey, courage is doing the right thing when I'm afraid. When I don't know what's going to happen, I'm going to do the right thing. And Mary went from a woman who had no future, who had no hope, who had no value, who had no control, to being one of the few who was courageous enough to stand at the foot of the cross with Jesus. The disciples ran except for John. John was there, but the others had all run. But something I love about Mary, who was caring for the corpse of Jesus after he died? Who washed the blood as it dried off of his cold, dead body? Who anointed him with fragrant oils just to honor him? Who showed up even the next day and the next day after he was dead to make sure his dead body was cared for? Wasn't Mary one of those women? What did that mean? What does that mean? It meant that Mary loved Jesus even when in her mind Jesus could do nothing more for her in return. He's dead. He can't do anything else for me. I don't think she was thinking of he's going to raise from the dead and he's going to come back in power and he's going to ascend into heaven and all. I think she just thought he's dead, but I love him so much, I will care for his dead body when he can never answer another prayer. He can never do another miracle for me. There's nothing else coming my way, yet I still love him. I think that's a great challenge and a great message for each one of us. I think we all have times, I know I do, where we say, God, why did you let this happen? God, where are you? How come I don't hear your voice? Why aren't you doing this? But we need to be like Mary and say, you know what, Jesus, even if you never did another thing for me, I'll do anything to honor you. I'll wash the blood off your cold, dead body because I love you, because I want to honor you. What an example she set for us. And then who was the first to see the resurrected Jesus as he rose from the dead? It was Mary. Mark chapter 16, verses 9 through 10. Now after he had risen early on the first day of the week, he first appeared to Mary Magdalene, from whom he had cast out 7 demons. She went and reported to those who had been with him. And then John chapter 20, verses 14 to 18, another account of this same event. When she had said this, she turned around and saw Jesus standing there. But she did not know that it was Jesus. And Jesus said to her, Woman, why are you weeping? Who are you looking for? Supposing him to be the gardener, she said to him, Sir, if you have carried him away, tell me where you have laid his body, and I will take him back. Jesus said to her, Mary, and she recognized his voice as he said her name. She turned and said in Hebrew, Teacher. And Jesus said to her, Stop holding on to me, for I have not yet ascended to my Father. But go to my brethren and say to them, I ascend to my Father and to your Father, to my God and to your God. And Mary Magdalene came announcing to the disciples, I have seen the Lord, and that he has said these things to me. Jesus loved Mary. He loved Mary for who she was. She was important to Jesus when she was totally unimportant to everybody else in the world, when she was nothing more than a pain to her family, a valueless, worthless woman. Jesus loved her, and she responded to that love by walking with him, even when she thought she could get nothing in return. How can we apply this to our lives? First of all, Jesus breaks social norms. He doesn't see through the same glasses that we see. He sees you as his sons. He sees you as his daughters. You may feel like Mary. You may feel trapped. You may feel tormented. You may feel miserable, addicted, afflicted, useless, hopeless, futureless, worthless, out of control, from an unknown town, an unimportant family, oppressed, maybe even possessed. But Jesus calls you to follow him. There's a true story of a young lady. She was 11 years old. It was about 10 years ago. Her name is Maricel Apitan, and she lived in the Philippines, a fairly poor town. And her uncle were from a Christian family, and they were walking to get water for the day. And as they were walking down the path, 4 men came out and ambushed them to rob him. And he fought back, and they struck him with machetes and knives, and he died. And she started to run, and one of them took a swipe at her and hit her in the back of the neck with a machete, and she fell to the ground. And they took a few other swipes at her, hitting her in the arms and in the back. And she went black. She blacked out. She lost consciousness. And then she regained consciousness as she was laying in a pool of her own blood. And she got up, and her neck was severely injured, and her wrists were severely cut. And she made her way to her feet, and almost like an out-of-body experience, she starts stumbling down the path to get back home. And she loses consciousness a couple times on the way home and stumbles and falls, and her hands were barely hanging on to her arms. She made it just to within earshot of her house, and she calls out for her mother. And her mother came out of the house and sees her daughter a bloody mess and doesn't know what happened. And she swoops her daughter up into her arms and carries her 12 kilometers to the nearest highway to get help. It took 3 hours to get to the nearest highway. And then it was another 5 hours that this girl was in surgery. She lived. And they caught the people that did this, and they went to prison and whatnot. But they asked her, "You're a Christian girl. Do you blame God? Why wasn't God there for you?" She said, "I don't blame God. I love God." And that woman was an overcomer. That little girl, she lost both her hands that day. But she had dreams of being a chef. And she grew, and she went through college and got her degree in the arts that she needed to. And just a couple years ago, she got hired on as a restaurant chef at a fancy hotel there in the Philippines. And she's a great testimony of what God can do. She learned to forgive. She learned to overcome. She is a girl who has no hands. She's 21 or 22 years old now, yet she's a chef. And you should see her work with these knives with her wrists and her hips, and she can carve up the meats and cook just as good as anyone else. She's making good money too. Top of her class. What a wonderful testimony of a young girl who's impoverished, lived through tragedy, is handicapped, yet she walks with Jesus. No bitterness, no anger, no unforgiveness, and just continually overcomes, walking with Jesus, letting Jesus lead the way. Mary was a woman who had everything against her, yet she walked with Jesus. But you have to leave the past in the past. Mary had to leave that home of chaos, that home of brokenness, that home where she had no hope or no future. She may have even upset her family by doing so. We don't know. But she chose freedom in Christ. She chose redemption. She chose love, and she chose a bright future as she would walk with Jesus. How can we apply that to our lives? Secondly, we want to take a look, and we'll be a little more, we'll go through this one a little quicker. A couple centurions who encountered Jesus. I know someone after last night said, well, there's another centurion in the Bible that we didn't cover. That's Cornelius. But today we're looking at two centurions who encountered Jesus face to face. What was a centurion? Roman numeral 2 there, soldiers and saints. There are a number of soldiers in the Scripture, especially the Old Testament, who loved God with all their heart, yet they were soldiers on the battlefield. Soldiers and saints, centurions. If you're filling in the blanks, no heart is too hard. We see Mary, there's no hopeless situation that's too hopeless. There's hope for the hopeless. If you feel hopeless, lost, or out of control, there's hope for you in Jesus. Walk with Him. And maybe you're like the centurion and your heart has grown hard, angry, bitter, maybe just apathetic, and you don't feel anything anymore. There's no heart too hard that Jesus can't change it. A centurion was a high-profile soldier in charge of 100 men. They were men of high stature. The centurions were the backbone of the Roman army. There were two in the New Testament that encountered Jesus. The first is seen in Matthew chapter 8, verses 5 through 13. And this man steps out in faith on behalf of his servant who's paralyzed. And Jesus is in his town, and he goes to Jesus and he says, Jesus, I need you to heal my servant. And Jesus looks at the man, and the man has such great faith. He says, I'm a man of authority, a centurion. He says, when I say to a man, go, he goes. When I say to another soldier, come here, he comes here. And I know you are a man of spiritual authority. If you will just speak, I know my servant will be made well. And Jesus was impressed by this man's faith. He says, go, your servant will be well. And his servant was healed that very moment. To trust God at His word. The second centurion we want to spend a couple minutes on. Who was the second one? He was the one at the cross. He was the one who executed Jesus, in charge of that execution. He was a hard-hearted and indifferent man. This centurion must have overseen hundreds, if not over 1,000 crucifixions. What would that do to the heart of a man? To have your primary job to put people to death in such a brutal way. A hard-hearted individual. He had overseen all these crucifixions with no compassion. He had heard every excuse in the book. He had heard men begging for their lives, blaspheming God. He had heard it all, and he had never shown compassion on one before. What was his experience with Jesus? First of all, he saw Jesus' passion. If you're following along, filling in the blanks, he saw Jesus' passion. John 18 and 19, he saw Jesus as Jesus did not fight back at the trial. In John 19, at the beginning of the chapter, he sees as Jesus takes the scourging, as they bend him over and they whip him 39 times with that whip with 9 endings, that 9 tails, and they ripped his back open. He stood and he watched. John 19, verse 17, he saw Jesus as he carried that beam of wood on his bloody, ripped open back down the road to Calvary. He saw the passion of Jesus. This centurion also heard the proclamations of Jesus. He heard Jesus' proclamations. Most men on a cross, they cursed, they begged, they blasphemed, but not Jesus. What did Jesus say from the cross? What might that centurion have heard Jesus say? 6 different things. In Luke 23 and in John 19 and Matthew 27, we see these different words of Jesus. From the cross, Jesus says, Father, forgive them. They don't know what they're doing. You think the centurion ever heard a man say that before? God, forgive them. He'd probably never heard anything like that. He may have heard as the one thief says to Jesus, Lord, remember me in your kingdom. And Jesus looks over at him and says, today you will be with me in paradise. Might that have made a difference in the heart of the centurion? I bet this one would have. When Jesus, beaten and bloody, beard ripped open, face bashed in, nailed to a cross, looks down at John, his disciple, and says, John, care for my mother after I'm gone. Jesus said that from the cross. He's looking out for his mother. Then he called out, my God, why have you forsaken me? And then Jesus said, I thirst. But the one that really broke through to the centurion, and it may seem odd, is when Jesus called out with a loud voice. It says in Luke 23:46, into your hands I commit my spirit. And he called out with a loud voice. It says, then the centurion said, truly, this was the Son of God. Because most men that died of crucifixion died of suffocation. They could no longer hold themselves up. What does it sound like when a man is suffocating? Very quiet. A few gasps, a few gags, and then he's gone. But Jesus didn't die that slow, gasping death, did he? He died of the wrath of God consuming his heart as that offering for all of our sin. And he called out, into your hands I commit my spirit. And when the centurion saw him yell with that loud voice and then fall dead, he said, truly this was the Son of God. He saw the passion, he heard the proclamations, and then he saw the power of Jesus. Luke 23:44, as Jesus was on the cross, there was darkness on the earth from noon until 3 p.m. That's very odd. Utter darkness over the earth. Mark 15, verse 39, when Jesus cried out with that loud voice from the cross, that was different. There was something powerful in that moment. Matthew 27:51, there was an earthquake and the rocks were splitting as Jesus was dying on the cross. The centurion is putting all these pieces of the puzzle together. Later, the centurion would have found out from Matthew 27:51 and 52, we see that he would have found out that the veil of the temple in the Jewish temple was torn in two when Jesus died. And that dead people had come from their graves and were walking around the city. He would have put all this together, but he said, truly, this was the Son of God. The centurion came to faith in Jesus. We see that declaration of faith. But there was a great church leader named Longinus in the first century church. He's from that same region, and he actually died a martyr for Christ, a great preacher and a great leader in the first century church, same time as this centurion would live. And Longinus, before he was a preacher and a church leader, do you know what he was? He was a centurion. And the church traditional history, there's no way of proving this, says that Longinus was that centurion who was at the cross of Christ. There's no way to prove that, but there's a fair chance that he was that man. There's only so many centurions in each region from the same region, the same time. So maybe he was. But either way, we see that this centurion, this hard-hearted man who had overseen many deaths and maybe even killed many himself, his heart was changed. How can we apply that to our lives this morning as we get ready to close? Jesus can change even the hardest of hearts, can't he? Maybe your heart is hard towards someone in your family. Maybe it's your spouse and you haven't been getting along and you just feel cold and you feel nothing anymore. Maybe you feel that way towards God. Come to Jesus today and say, Jesus, my heart has grown hard. Change my heart, oh God. You're not too far lost. Nobody is outside of the reach of Jesus. He's calling all of us to follow him. No matter who you are or what you have done, God has a calling for you. And you know where that calling starts? With that calling of follow me. Walk with me. Mary, you're hopeless. I'll set you free. I'll deliver you. Walk with me on this adventure. The centurion, a hard-hearted man, there's hope for him as well. Follow me. Let's stand to our feet. If we could have the worship team come and we'll prepare to close. This morning, if you'd like to respond to the message, come forward. If you feel hopeless, maybe you're praying for someone whose life is out of control. Maybe you are that someone. Maybe it's a loved one. Their life doesn't seem to have much value or worth. Maybe they're mentally ill. Maybe they're demon-possessed. Maybe they struggle with addiction. I don't know what it is, but there's hope for them. There's hope for you. There was hope for Mary. She's one of the great heroes of the Bible. The greatest book ever written, a book that's alive and powerful, a book written by the Spirit of God, and yet she was hopeless before that. And a centurion, strong man, a rugged man, a number of centurions giving their hearts to the Lord, soldiers coming to Christ and walking with God. If any of this struck a chord with you and you feel you need to respond, you feel the Holy Spirit on your heart now, come forward and respond. Seek the Lord in prayer. Connie, if you could lead us in song and then close us in prayer. Let's just spend some time thinking on these things and worshiping the Lord together.